This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
Portrait painter Jeff Bass on this edition of Conversations. Early on, it seemed Jeff Bass' artistic abilities would lead him to a career in architecture. But he soon discovered the lure of the advertising world. His role as an illustrator at an ad agency led him even deeper into advertising and media. Along the way, he worked as an on-camera and voice talent, and even spent a few years as a news anchor. But time and circumstances often have a way of leading a person back to their true calling. In the case of Jeff Bass, fine art. Today, you'll find his work in such places as the Smithsonian, the CIA, the National World War II Museum, the International Spy Museum, the National Naval Aviation Museum, and many other places around the world. We welcome Jeff Bass to Conversations. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
How old were you when you first started
your
artistic work?
I think I was drawing as early as I can remember when I was a small child. But I didn't really start painting until I was about 9 years old. My mother took up painting as a hobby, and she had artistic ability herself. And when I was a child, I simply picked up her equipment and started emulating what she was doing, and I was copying images. My mother, her hobby was copying 19th century paintings, and so I kind of followed on that and developed my ability as a painter at a very young age. It was providential. Okay. So I was very fortunate.
Now, did you start taking classes in high school?
I did. Growing up in Anniston, Alabama, I took lessons with Dr. Martha Simpson. Okay. And some of my Anniston acquaintances, if they see this, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. She's still very much with us. But she was running a kind of informal atelier at the Anniston Museum of Natural History. Now, most people would be surprised that a town that size would have a natural history museum.
Right.
That's a whole story unto itself. And but it was, like I said, it was very providential because she was able to convey to me the kinds of the type of academic atelier instruction that one might receive at the Art Students League in New York or at one of the academies in Florence, because she had studied that herself. And ideally, that's just about the right age to start, when you're in your early teens, to begin training in traditional academic art. So I was very fortunate.
Yes. Now, you went to college thinking you were going to be an architect?
Yes.
And what changed? Why not stay the architectural route?
You know, I think a lot of people are driven by the idea that well, let me phrase it another way. I think people pursue a particular vocation because they think they're supposed to do that, rather than because they want to do it. And I had some artistic ability, and at that time I didn't really see how you could really make a living or become successful as an artist. That was something that was so far beyond my realm of thought that I thought, well, the logical follow-on to that would be to become an architect. And after a couple of years I became terribly disillusioned with it, very bored with it. Everybody goes into architecture thinking they're going to be Frank Lloyd Wright. And I frankly just became bored with it. I quit school, and to truncate a lot of history there, I went to work in the advertising industry doing freelance illustration. And concurrent with that, when I was in high school, I was an illustrator for a department store, and they asked me to appear in a television commercial. And so I started doing commercials. So I wore all the hats in the advertising industry, working in Birmingham, Alabama in the mid-'80s, doing voiceovers and being in commercials. I was even in some print ads for a department store, and working as an illustrator, moonlighting, doing the TV thing.
Now, were you still doing fine art on the side?
You know, for a period of time, I did not. Commercial illustration, which was still viable at that time, that took up all the oxygen out of the other things that I was doing. So my interest, or my fine art sensibilities, took a back seat for a period of time.
At what point did you say, okay, I'm going to get serious about fine art? What was it that triggered that next move?
Well, again, I have to track this in parallel with the other career that I was that was starting to gain traction. It was suggested, that I should be a broadcast journalist, because I was, what people expressed that I was good on camera. Mm-hmm. And I thought that would be a logical way to pursue that. Doing commercials is kind of a capricious career, much like being a freelance illustrator. It's more like a real job, in quotes.
Right, right.
And so I went back to school at Florida State University, got a degree in communication and journalism. And out of the frenetic world of advertising, I was into the frenetic world of broadcast journalism. And on weekends, I started to pick up painting again. And this time my sensibilities about it were different. I went back to my fine art training. I was more interested in doing something that was serious rather than something that was kind of piecemeal and mercurial like commercial illustration. And drawing on my interest in natural history subjects from the Anniston Museum of Natural History, where I trained as a young painter, I started painting waterfowl that was indigenous to this part of the country. Birds like egrets and herons, and started exhibiting, and the paintings started to sell. They would sell as quickly as I could paint them. Family, friends expressed interest in the work. And so in a parallel track with my broadcast career, I was able to vent some of the pressure of the broadcast career by painting on the weekends.
Right, right. And so eventually you just said, this is successful enough that I don't have to do the broadcasting, the local news stuff anymore.
Yes, it took on a life of its own. And providentially, that word keeps coming up in my thought process, and I believe it is providence. I believe in those things. The station that I was working for was in financial trouble. This was an NBC affiliate station. Maybe I shouldn't.
No, it was fine.
say that, but it was an NBC affiliate station. It was in trouble financially, and they were shutting down the news department. I was offered a job as a news director at a station in Georgia, and I could not see myself going to another small market station somewhere and grueling it out as a news director. As you probably know, that's a very tedious job. And I just made a decision. I just jumped off the ledge and decided to become a fine artist.
Now, you're probably best known for some of your portraits, for example, George H.W. Bush. Yes. How did it come about that you got to paint the former president?
Very circuitous path, much like my career. At that time, I had my work started to get the attention of a lot of people, some important people. I happened to know one of the board members at the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation. At that time, I was starting to accept portrait commissions, and he expressed interest in having a portrait of President George H.W. Bush for the Naval Aviation Museum and the foundation, because he was an honorary board chairman at the foundation and was a former naval aviator. So it's perfectly logical that he should be enshrined in that museum. And so we had a family friend who was relatively close to the Bush family. And again, to truncate some history and all the nuts and bolts of that, the next thing I knew, a few months later, I was on a plane headed for Houston and met with the 41st President of the United States, took photographs and some notes, and we discussed his preferences about the portrait. And it was decided that he should wear an A2 leather flight jacket, which is emblematic of naval aviation and the fact that he was a naval aviator. That was not discussed at the time, but when I was meeting with President Bush, he showed me some of these kinds of constituent photographs they would sign and mail to constituents. And there was one famous photograph of President Bush from the Gulf War era, the first Gulf War. He's wearing an A2 flight jacket with a mouton collar, talking to some reporters, and he said, "This is a photograph my family likes." And so that was the genesis of the idea for that painting and how we designed it. Which what we're looking at here is a reproduction of the painting that has been installed in the tribute room of CVN 77, the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier, named in his honor and commissioned 3 years ago, right after the current president was elected. Was very delighted that the Bush family selected that. A copy of the painting also resides at the George H.W. Bush Library, a print of the painting. and the museum designer decided that it should go in the tribute room. A tribute room is simply an onboard museum, and these presidential aircraft carriers of the Nimitz class all have these tribute rooms, is my understanding, and they have artifacts relative to the namesake of the ship.
So you worked from a combination of photographs, and also did he sit for you for a while?
He didn't really do any sittings. President Bush is very much a type A kind of personality. He's not really keen on doing sittings, so he took a lot of photographs, and I made some notes, and we chatted. And what portrait painters do traditionally, when they can't paint from life, you use mannequins and you use garments and clothing that you can reference from direct observation to help lend some integrity to the painting. And then you go off the photographs in your notes to fill in the blank, so to speak.
Is it more difficult to paint somebody who is a public figure, particularly a well-known public figure, than it is just somebody off the street?
Well, it's difficult in this sense. It's like a public performance. The pressure is on and you have to perform. And I'll be very candid and say that there are some I like better than others, you know, and when you produce a specific result, you're expected to continue to produce that kind of result. Right. It's like being a performer. You know, if you do a great performance, if you're a singer or an actor, you're expected to, you know, you're competing with yourself in a sense.
Right, right. What did the president say, former president say, after you completed the painting?
He was, it's my understanding, he was very pleased with it. And in fact, I guess confirmation of that was the selection of the painting to be reproduced for CVN 77. And I also got an email, an email from his secretary, and she expressed that that was one of his favorite portraits. The Naval Aviation Museum Foundation made prints of the portrait. And this is a photo of President Bush signing prints of his portrait. 500 prints were made, and he signed all of them. And the museum, I think, was selling the prints to raise funds for the foundation, and he was kind enough to do that for them.
Very good. I want to touch on a couple other ones that you've done. The next one is entitled Virginia Hall.
Yes.
This is a fascinating story.
It is. I love this story. This was a fun project. This was a painting commissioned for the Central Intelligence Agency for their intelligence fine art collection. She was an exceptionally gifted spy, a female spy from the World War II era. She was working with the State Department in the 1930s. She's an American woman. She had a terrible hunting accident in Izmir, Turkey, when she was working with the Foreign Service. It resulted in the amputation of her left leg below the knee. She was in Paris during, she was in Paris when World War II broke out. And she had resigned from the State Department because she knew that her options were limited because of her prosthetic limb, frankly. And so she decided to volunteer for the French ambulance service. The French, of course, France fell to the Germans. The Germans invaded. She fled France, went back to England. The British were desperate for spies, and she was very fluent in German and French. She took a job at, I think, as a military attaché at one of the consulates in the consulate in London. And she was given a list of names. Long story short, she went to a party hosted by one Vera Atkins, who worked for Maurice Buckmaster, who was head of the French F section of the Special Operations Executive. That was the British spy agency at the time. She was recruited and quickly hired. She was deployed into France. She was the first female spy working for the SOE in France. And she wasn't even British, she was American. And we weren't involved in the war at this point. Okay. And she was so effective. She established an intelligence network known as Heckler, and she was so effective that the Germans were after her. She was known as Ladon Keybois, the limping lady, because of the prosthetic limb. She was too hot. She had to be extracted from France. She wanted to go back in and continue to work. She was betrayed by a double agent. Maurice Buckmaster wouldn't allow her to go back into France. So at that time, this is also rather providential. The OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, had been formed by General Donovan. That was the predecessor to the CIA. He agreed to let her go back into France, but in disguise. So she went back in and reconnected with some of her old comrades, and she was so effective. I think she was responsible for the capture of something like 800 Germans, the death of 150 Nazis. She was given the Order of the British Empire by the British. She was given the American Distinguished Service Cross. Now this is a female, 60 years ago, getting an award like that, which was really remarkable.
Yeah. And how did you find out about her? How did it?
There is an outside advocacy outside of the CIA who was interested in having some of the intelligence history chronicled in a visual form, and Virginia Hall was emblematic of the OSS, the predecessor to CIA, and so she was selected as one of the subjects that should be portrayed and perhaps donated to the CIA Intelligence Art Collection. Judith Pearson, an author who authored this book about Virginia Hall, which by the way has been optioned as a film, she was able to lend contacts to me, some of her historical and research contacts. And I really didn't know much about her prior to reading the book, and in the process of researching the painting I learned all of this, and it's just a fabulous story. I could do a whole show on Virginia Hall. Judith Pearson is probably better prepared to do that than I am. She's really the expert on Virginia Hall. But the painting was unveiled at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. in 2006 in conjunction with the British Embassy. And it's really a terrific story. History came full circle. A document called the Royal Warrant that she should have received when she received the Order of the British Empire had been lost. And in the process of researching the painting and getting ready for this unveiling event, the British discovered the document, and it was presented to Lorna Catling, her niece, one of her only heirs. Virginia Hall has been deceased for some time. So it's really wonderful to bring history full circle that way.
How did you go about collecting the pictures in which you were used to ultimately paint?
Very good question. That's another 1-hour dissertation I could do. The methodology is very complex because there's no one singular image or photograph that exists of any of these events. So in essence, this is like this is a kind of forensic exercise where you have to piece together a historical event just from extant subject matter or from recollections. The young man in the painting of Virginia Hall in the background, his name was Edward Labrat. His younger cousin, Jean Labrat, is still alive, and he witnessed them when she was making these radio transmissions from Chambord-sur-Lignon, where she was deployed in south central France, back to London. She would relay intelligence back to the Allies in London. He was witness to this, and he was able to help me flesh out this event. The International Spy Museum has a copy of this painting in addition to the CIA, and her actual radio set is at the International Spy Museum. Wow. I had photographs of it. This is tantamount to a cinematic production. I had to make these props and basically fabricate these artifacts. I turned part of my studio into a French barn. Jean Labrat sent me photographs of the interior of this barn, which is still standing, where she would actually make these radio transmissions in Chambord-sur-Lignon. And so I was able to piece together the event visually that way.
It's absolutely fascinating. Let's take a look at this. Dien Bien Phu.
Yes. There are a lot of complex historical moving parts to this. Suffice it to say, this was the culmination of the first Indochina War. After the Second World War, the communist Viet Minh filled a power vacuum and sought to depose the French colonialist. This was at the height of the Cold War in the mid-1950s. The doctrine under the Eisenhower administration was one of containment. We were concerned about, you probably are familiar with the phrase, the domino theory. We were concerned about communist hegemony in the Far East during that time. But General Eisenhower did not want to deploy American troops to help the French. This is following on the Korean War, which was stalemated, and before that the World War II. So we were not keen on seeing American boys in another conflict like this. So we were helping the French covertly through paramilitary components of the CIA. One of those components was Civil Air Transport, which was an actual real functioning airline, but it was owned by the CIA. And the planes were flown by CIA pilots. We were essentially dropping supplies to the French at their principal garrison, Dien Bien Phu, and trying to sustain them, but ultimately Dien Bien Phu fell to the communist Viet Minh on May 7th, 1954. This event here, depicted in this painting, took place on May 6th, the day before Dien Bien Phu fell to the communists. The plane is being piloted by one James McGovern, otherwise known as Earthquake Magoon, because he was this big hirsute fellow who was very robust and had a legendary reputation in the CIA and civil air transport. His co-pilot was Wallace Buford. Their plane was shot up that day. They limped across the border into Laos and crashed. They were both killed. And arguably, they were the first two casualties of the Vietnam War, because the Second Indochina War, which was our war, the Vietnam War, was simply a follow-on to that conflict that essentially was unsettled. The communists wanted to unify the country under communism. Shortly after this event, Vietnam was divided to the 17th parallel by the Geneva Accords, and the communists still wanted to unify the country under communism. And I'm trivializing a very complex piece of history. Historians are probably yelling at the TV right now if they're seeing this, but suffice it to say, the Vietnam War, our iteration of that followed on this event, and the rest is history, as they say.
As they say. And speaking of history, let's take a look at the Reykjavik Summit.
Yes.
I think you've done a nice job of capturing. Tell everyone what's going on here.
This is a preliminary oil study for the final painting. The final painting will not resemble this very closely. This painting, this is another Cold War subject. This depicts the 1986 Reykjavik Summit between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. I think this followed on a similar summit in Geneva. This was a watershed event. This was part of the machinery that ended the Cold War, this particular event. The Soviets were making historic concessions, and Ronald Reagan was seeking concessions that would draw down the nuclear arsenal that threatened the world at this time. But one of the cards that was on the table, so to speak, was Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, as it was well known at that time.
That's right.
The Soviets thought it was much further along than it really was. Really, it was still just a concept, and they were terrified of it.
Right.
And one of the stipulations is that we take the Star Wars component off the table, and they would make these concessions. Well, President Reagan wouldn't budge. He wanted to, and in fact, he wanted to share the technology with the Soviets. He literally wanted to basically disarm the world of nuclear weapons or make them irrelevant. Star Wars potentially would have done that, as he argued it. So initially, the summit was considered a failure because the Soviets wouldn't allow Star Wars to continue, the Strategic Defense Initiative. So they did not agree to the concessions, but shortly thereafter, events took their course, and the Soviets could not sustain their military arsenal. There were a lot of other moving parts of that era too, but this summit was a watershed piece of Cold War history.
Now, you said that is not in its final state, it's
Correct.
not in its final production. What will it look like when you're finished? How will it change from what we just saw?
Well, it's hard to articulate that, but I can kind of thumbnail it. The painting will draw in rather more tightly around the principles. Edward Shevardnadze, who was the counterpart to George Shultz, our Secretary of State at the time, it essentially will think of a card game, a poker game, and that's essentially what the painting will look like. It will just rather frame in more tightly on the four participants in this watershed summit conference, and hopefully it will convey some of the for want of a better way to describe it, some of the drama and some of the emotions of that conference, which was really quite critical at the time.
How do you, as a painter, how do you capture that atmosphere? Because obviously you weren't there, so how do you capture it?
Well, Secretary Shultz, who now occupies a chair at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, has been guiding this particular painting project. And we've had several discussions about the painting, and he was able to convey some inside information. And basically just drawing on his sense of it and trying to infuse some of that into the painting and lend some integrity to it, hopefully will convey the atmospherics, so to speak, for want of a better word at the time.
Typically speaking, how many iterations of this will you go through before it's completed?
Some of these paintings are very complex. Like I said, it's the equivalent of a forensic exercise where you're deconstructing a historical event. In some cases, it's very much like a cinematic production, as I referenced earlier, where you have to make props and that kind of thing. This is a little different. This is more trying to convey the atmospherics and the psyche, you know, of this conference. And then there are some nuts and bolts issues, like what they were wearing. It was only a 2-day conference. It was a Saturday and a Sunday. This painting will depict the Sunday, the culmination of the summit conference. President Reagan really, in a very genuine sense, really made a connection with Mikhail Gorbachev. And this was a bit of a mystery, even to his own staff. They really kind of found their own wavelength, so to speak. And they had a connection, and so that's the challenge. That's what I'm trying to convey in the paintings.
Trying to capture that relationship.
That's right. There's a little bit of electricity to it. And, there was even a bit of like I said, there was some mystery surrounding their relationship, even to his own staff. Somehow, these two men, they made a particular connection at that time in history, and were able to have some mutual understanding, and they were able to accomplish historic concessions that would have been unimaginable previously.
Yeah, that connection essentially changed the world.
It really did.
Yeah, it really did. Jeff, we've got just a short period of time. This is former Florida Governor Charlie Crist, a portrait you did.
Yes, I've painted our last two sitting governors, Governor Bush before Governor Crist, and this painting was unveiled recently. This is more of a garden variety kind of portrait of a statesman or an official. I didn't have a lot of time to do this painting, frankly. As you recall, this time last year we were dealing with the oil spill in the Gulf.
Yeah.
And I had a very difficult time scheduling any sittings or sessions with Governor Crist. I had just a smattering of photographs and a brief meeting to work on, so I kept the painting rather simplistic.
Yeah. Was he pretty satisfied with it?
I think he was. He seemed to be pleased with it.
Yeah. I wouldn't call that simplistic. Looks pretty good to me.
Well, thank you kindly.
Jeff, it's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure.
What can we look forward to seeing in the future from you? Anything on the...
Well, hopefully the completion of the Reykjavik painting in the very near term to comply with the 100th anniversary year of President Reagan's birth, and also this October, just next month, will be the 25th anniversary of the Reykjavik summit, which took place in 1986.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jeff Bass. It's been a real pleasure. You can find out more about Jeff Bass at jeffbass.com. As for this Jeff, we're on Facebook at Conversations with Jeff Weeks, and you can view some of our past episodes online at wsre.org/conversations. Hope you enjoyed the broadcast. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you for watching. Take good care of yourself, and we'll see you soon.
Support for this program is provided in part by these corporate sponsors. And by viewers like you.